Lewis Hamilton hit with a 10-second penalty at the Canadian Grand Prix for exceeding track limits. Stay until the end to witness the heated argument between Hamilton and Frederic Vasseur over not being warned in time. The Austrian Grand Prix drew to a close with what initially seemed like routine post-race formalities. The crowd began to disperse, the mechanics rolled their cars back into the garages, and the television crews shifted their attention to podium celebrations and driver interviews. But behind the scenes, something far more turbulent was unraveling. Just as the dust settled over the Spielberg circuit, an unexpected announcement from race control sparked confusion and outrage within one of the sport's most legendary garages. Lewis Hamilton, who had just completed what many had assumed was a clean, strategic and resilient drive, was handed a post-race time penalty, 10 seconds added to his final result, for repeated violations of track limits during the Grand Prix. The ruling demoted him multiple positions in the official classification and triggered a chain reaction of internal scrutiny and emotional fallout that no one, not even those closest to him, had fully anticipated. The penalty, enforced retroactively, didn't stem from a single dramatic moment but rather an accumulation of infractions. The stewards cited consistent breaches of the white lines at turns 9 and 10, two high-speed, exit-sensitive sections of the track where drivers frequently ride the curbs to preserve momentum. Hamilton, known for dancing on the razor's edge of grip and compliance, had apparently stepped over the line one time too many. According to the official report, after multiple notifications, including a final black and white flag warning, Hamilton failed to significantly modify his driving trajectory to remain within the legal confines of the circuit. However, within the Mercedes garage, the atmosphere was one of disbelief, not only at the decision itself but at how poorly it had been communicated. Under typical circumstances, teams are expected to act swiftly when their driver edges close to a penalty-triggering threshold. The usual chain of response includes an internal alert from the FIA to the team, followed by immediate, clear radio instructions to the driver. Track limits warning, you're on your final strike, is the kind of message drivers are used to receiving with sharp clarity. But in Hamilton's case, according to several internal sources and data from the race communication logs, such a message never came. Instead, he was told more passively to be careful on exits, or to keep an eye on track limits, phrasing that failed to convey the severity of his situation. Hamilton's perspective, as revealed later in hushed conversations within the paddock, was one of astonishment and mounting resentment. He had no idea, during the crucial middle stints of the race, that his actions were being tallied toward a penalty that would reshape his final result. From his vantage point in the car, each limit breach felt marginal, barely distinguishable from a legal line run. The tires were wearing quickly, the wind was inconsistent through Sector 3, and grip levels were fluctuating due to rubber deposits from previous sessions. All these variables made it difficult to determine in real time whether a fraction of the tire had crossed the white line or not. That's where the team comes in, to monitor, inform, and react in real time. And this time, Hamilton believed, they failed him. When he climbed out of the car, the tension in his body language was unmistakable. Normally gracious, Hamilton barely acknowledged the marshals and didn't respond to the light-hearted congratulations from a nearby Red Bull engineer. As he removed his helmet and pulled off his balaclava, his expression remained impassive, yet his eyes carried the weight of anger he refused to vocalize in public. A Mercedes strategist quickly approached him with a tablet in hand, attempting to show him the data related to the warnings. Hamilton didn't even glance at it. "Why wasn't I told?" he asked flatly. No answer was offered. In an unexpected twist, Hamilton abruptly veered away from the usual team post-race route. Rather than heading directly to the Mercedes hospitality area, he turned sharply into the Ferrari enclave, an area typically off-limits to rival drivers during sensitive debrief windows. The security at the entrance, caught off guard, hesitated for a split second before allowing him in. Observers across the paddock watched with wide eyes, unsure whether this was a power move, a protest, or the beginning of a deeper message being sent across team boundaries. Inside the Ferrari suite, Frederic Vasseur, known for his calm demeanor and decades-long familiarity with Hamilton dating back to the British driver's GP2 days, was seated in a low-lit room reviewing telemetry with engineers. The moment Hamilton entered, Vasseur stood up slowly, offering no smile, no handshake, only a knowing nod. They exchanged no words initially, just a long-waited look. Then, without ceremony, Vasseur gestured toward a side office, and the two disappeared behind closed doors. Speculation inside the paddock reached a fever pitch. Was this a signal? Was Hamilton contemplating something bigger, sending a message to his current team by walking into the headquarters of their historic rivals? Was he simply seeking a neutral sounding board, a trusted voice from outside the immediate chaos? Or was this an emotionally charged decision, made in the heat of the moment after feeling abandoned by those who were supposed to protect him during battle? Meanwhile, back in the Mercedes garage, team personnel scrambled to prepare for the media fallout. A hastily convened technical debrief was underway, but it lacked its most important participant. Without Hamilton present, the room was tense. Engineers debated whether the track limits breaches had truly been visible on the driver's onboard feed. Some argued the team's alerts had been too vague. Others blamed shifting FIA standards. "It's a gray area," one strategist muttered. And gray areas don't help when you're fighting for points in the midfield. Team principal Toto Wolff, known for his emotional control, looked unusually rattled during his brief interaction with the press. When asked if the penalty was justified, he paused for several seconds before answering. "We'll review the process. The driver can't make the right decisions if the information isn't reaching him in time. That's on us." Drivers from other teams offered varying levels of sympathy and critique. Charles Leclerc admitted, "It's hard to judge from inside the cockpit. You need your team to be crystal clear when you're close to a penalty." Fernando Alonso was more blunt, "If your team doesn't warn you, you can't blame the driver. Simple as that." Yuki Tsunoda, meanwhile, laughed off the situation entirely, saying, "I always get screamed at on the radio when I'm near track limits. Maybe Lewis needs someone to yell at him too." Eventually, Hamilton re-emerged, leaving the Ferrari building without saying a word to the assembled media. His walk was slower, more deliberate, and not a single camera caught him looking up. When he finally returned to the Mercedes motorhome, he entered through a side door, avoiding the journalists still lingering in hopes of a quote. Inside, he sat down with his race engineer, but the conversation was brief. "I don't want explanations now," he said quietly. "Just make sure this never happens again." That night, Hamilton broke his silence online. On his social media accounts, he posted a single statement against a black background. Racing at this level requires trust, between driver and team, driver and officials, driver and the car. If one part of that chain breaks, everything falls apart. No blame. Just lessons. The message was clear. Diplomatic. Professional. But beneath it, longtime fans and insiders alike saw something deeper. A fracture not just from the penalty, but from the erosion of confidence in the very system that's meant to help him thrive. And in Formula One, once trust begins to erode, everything else, team unity, strategic cohesion, championship momentum, becomes vulnerable. Hamilton isn't just racing against other drivers. He's racing against time, against legacy, against the narrowest margins of performance and failure. When he feels unsupported, unheard, or misinformed, it shakes the foundation. And no amount of after-the-fact apologies or technical clarifications can undo what's been lost in that moment of silence on the radio, when the most experienced driver on the grid was left guessing while his fate was being sealed corner by corner, lap after lap. The air inside Ferrari's post-race operations room was stifling, thick with suppressed tension, quiet murmurs, and the unrelenting weight of unspoken frustration. The door had barely clicked shut before Lewis Hamilton's composure cracked, and the emotional dam holding back his fury gave way. He peeled off the top of his race suit with quick, agitated movements, the fabric sticking to his sweat-drenched skin. There was no time for pleasantries, no attempt to ease into the conversation. His voice came fast, sharp, and loaded with frustration that had clearly been building not just over the course of the race, but over several weekends. "This shouldn't be happening," he said through gritted teeth, pacing between the narrow rows of monitors and engineers, his tone rising not in volume, but in urgency. "This isn't a Formula 2 weekend. This is elite-level racing. And I'm out there with no precise communication from the team when I'm walking the tightrope with the stewards. That's not a gray area, that's black and white. If I'm one infraction away from a time penalty, I have to know. In real time. Not 2 corners too late. Not as an afterthought." Fred Vasseur, standing with arms folded near the main strategy desk, attempted to maintain control of the room. He took a single step forward, keeping his tone neutral, almost clinical. "Lewis, we relayed all 3 warnings via the radio. You acknowledged the second one." "I didn't acknowledge a thing," Hamilton interrupted, stopping abruptly mid-stride. His eyes burned with disbelief as he stared across the room. "I heard vague messages. Watch your lines. Keep it clean." But no one said, "You've used all 3 lifelines. One more and it's a penalty." That's the kind of message you spell out. You don't dance around it. I'm managing battery, tire degradation, car balance, fuel deltas, fighting off George in DRS range, and trying to stay within a second of Lando. You think I've got time to decode soft warnings? There was a pause, just long enough for every person in the room to feel the weight of those words. The tension wasn't just between Hamilton and Vasseur, it radiated to the engineers, the strategists, the data analysts, all of whom suddenly found themselves caught in the crossfire between a champion's expectations and the team's operational execution. Vasseur remained composed, but there was a flicker of strain around his eyes. Multiple teams were caught out today. The messages from race control were sporadic. 5 drivers. I'm not racing 5 drivers. I'm racing for Ferrari, Hamilton snapped, cutting him off. I don't give a damn what chaos unfolded in other garages. That's not my concern. I'm not paid to sympathize with the field. I'm paid to bring Ferrari results. And I expect Ferrari to deliver a level of precision and clarity that matches that goal. His words landed with the force of a hammer, each syllable a strike against the wall of excuses being cautiously erected in front of him. He wasn't just disappointed. He was betrayed by the very structure he was supposed to lean on when navigating the razor-thin margins of a race that demanded perfection. An engineer cautiously spoke up from the back of the room, trying to provide context about the alert systems, how they rely on a combination of FIA timing and onboard sensors. But Hamilton didn't even turn to look. "Don't give me back-end excuses," he said, voice lower now, dangerously calm. "I don't want to hear about delays and dashboards and glitches. I want to know who had the information, and why that information didn't make it to my ear in the language of urgency." He was demanding accountability, not just explanations, not just analysis, but a genuine reckoning with a systemic breakdown that had cost him valuable track position and potentially the podium. Vasseur tried again, more diplomatic now. "We're already reviewing the comms timeline. There were multiple overlapping instructions. Managing tires, pushing in Sector 2, fending off George, and none of those mean anything if I'm slapped with a 5-second penalty after the fact," Hamilton interjected. "You can have a perfect tire strategy and a well-managed energy deployment, but if you miss the key moment when your driver's on the brink of a penalty, everything else becomes irrelevant. It nullifies the strategy. It turns the whole plan into paper." Hamilton paused, glancing at one of the strategy screens still glowing with telemetry and sector data. He wasn't speaking purely in anger anymore. Now, it was layered with frustration born from high standards. The kind of disappointment that comes not from failure, but from the sense that preventable mistakes were allowed to happen under pressure. "I've raced in every kind of storm," he continued. "Wet tracks, dry tracks, red flags, radio failures, safety cars, you name it. But the one thing I've always counted on is that my team would have my back. That they'd filter through the noise and give me the crucial facts when it mattered. Today, that didn't happen. Today, I was left second-guessing, and when you're doing 310 kilometers per hour into a braking zone, second-guessing gets you nowhere." Someone quietly scribbled notes onto a tablet. Another adjusted his headset, pretending to look busy. But no one dared meet Hamilton's gaze directly. His words weren't just critiques, they were indictments, surgical in precision. "I understand racing is chaos," Hamilton said, softening slightly, but still firm. "But that's exactly why we prepare. That's why we drill, simulate, analyze. To make sure we're ready when it descends into madness. Because the chaos isn't going away. If anything, it's getting worse. Track limits are being monitored like never before. Margins are tighter. FIA communication is unpredictable. Which means our communication has to be bulletproof. No margin for ambiguity." Vasseur gave a slight nod, finally offering, "You're right. We should have phrased it differently. You needed a crystal-clear message. That's on us." Hamilton exhaled through his nose, crossing his arms. "This isn't just about one race. It's about the culture we're building. If I can't trust the pit wall to give me black and white instructions when the penalty clock is ticking, how am I supposed to go full tilt with confidence? I need to know the house isn't made of glass." He took one final glance around the room. His disappointment was no longer erupting, it had hardened into something colder, more enduring. A quiet demand for structural change. I came to Ferrari because I believe in what this team can be. But believing isn't enough. We've got to be that team. Right now. Not in 3 races. Not next year. Now. And with that, he picked up his water bottle from the table, the silence now absolute, and walked out, leaving behind a room of seasoned professionals who suddenly felt like rookies under the pressure of a champion's unforgiving standard. Once the chaotic swirl of post-race emotions had dulled to a simmer, Lewis Hamilton, still grappling with the weight of confusion and frustration, stepped away from the Ferrari motorhome and found a quiet corridor at the far end of the paddock. He moved with purpose but also with the kind of restraint that comes from years of experience. He wasn't storming off, he was composing himself. As he paced slowly, helmet off, gloves tucked beneath his arm, he retrieved his phone and scrolled for a name that had been a fixture in his career for more than a decade. He needed not just to vent but to seek understanding, context, and maybe even reassurance from someone who had stood beside him through championships, setbacks, and every drama in between. Without hesitation, he pressed call. The name on the screen, Toto Wolff. The line rang a few times, and then came the familiar voice, calm, collected, unmistakably Austrian. "Lewis, talk to me." There was no hesitation. No polite build-up. Hamilton was already deep in thought, and he unleashed it with the force of someone who had been silently carrying a load for far too long. "Toto, I wasn't taking liberties out there. That car was hanging on by a thread. I wasn't driving beyond the limit to be reckless. I was trying to find the limit without losing the rear. Those curbs in the fast corners, they were like ice. I wasn't getting time out of it. And even then, I didn't know I was that close to getting flagged until it was already too late. It felt like being penalized after running a race in fog." Toto, ever the composed strategist, leaned back in his chair somewhere far from the paddock but entirely present in the moment. "I reviewed the onboard feeds. You were threading a needle lap after lap. I saw how little room you had. You were skating on a razor's edge. But if race control says you exceeded the boundary, they're going by sensor data, not intent." Hamilton's tone grew more urgent, not confrontational but intense, raw. "It's not about intent. I'm not denying the infraction. What's unacceptable is that I wasn't told in time. No final warning. No next time you're out. I'm supposed to manage tire temps, energy recovery, fuel deltas, adjust diff mid-corner, and now somehow guess how many strikes I've racked up. How is that professional racing? I'm not out there to play bingo, I'm trying to win." There was a pause. Toto didn't jump in right away. He knew Lewis too well. Knew when to let the silence carry meaning. After a moment, he offered a measured reply. "The systems are meant to give live feedback. You should have had that information through the pit wall. But I've seen cases this season where it's delayed or lost in the noise. You're not wrong to feel blindsided." Hamilton kept going, unable to stop the flow now that it had begun. "It's not just this race. It's how unpredictable it's all become. There's no continuity in how the rules are enforced. One circuit lets you ride the curb, another calls it a breach. Sometimes it's 3 warnings, sometimes 4. Some drivers get verbal notes, others don't. And through all of it, we're supposed to keep our heads down and accept it as fair play. That's not Formula One, that's roulette." Wolff's voice remained calm, but his tone hinted at agreement. "You're voicing what a lot of drivers feel but don't always say out loud. Track limits have gone from being a safety tool to a regulatory obsession. The intention is to create fairness, but the execution has bred confusion." Lewis exhaled sharply, then added, "There's this illusion of precision because of all the technology, but in reality it's chaotic. How is it possible that with dozens of cameras, floor sensors, and GPS overlays, we still have ambiguity? We shouldn't be guessing. It should be binary. But it isn't." Toto didn't argue the point. When the lines are painted but the interpretation isn't, we lose clarity. I don't believe the stewards are biased, but I do believe the framework they're working in is flawed. There's a difference. Hamilton's voice lowered slightly, but the intensity didn't. "You remember how many times in the past I've said, 'Let us race'? That wasn't just a slogan. It was a plea. Because now we've reached the point where a driver can lose a podium without ever touching another car. Not because of strategy, not because of tires, but because of an invisible line a few centimeters wide that varies in enforcement depending on which marshal's in the box that day. This isn't the sport we built." Wolff understood that this wasn't simply about track limits, it was about something deeper. About control. About the direction the sport was moving. About the mental fatigue of trying to compete in a system that increasingly felt engineered more by algorithms than racers. "You're not wrong," he said softly. "The bureaucracy is overtaking the spontaneity. And the fans? They feel it too. They don't cheer for penalties, they cheer for passes, for battles, for storylines that unfold on track, not on a spreadsheet." Lewis nodded slowly, even though Toto couldn't see it. "Exactly. And the younger drivers? They're growing up thinking this is normal. That precision driving is just about respecting lines and avoiding penalties. But racing isn't a geometry lesson. It's art. It's instinct. It's grit. And if we keep sterilizing it, we'll lose everything that made it special." Toto leaned forward now, voice low but purposeful. "So what do you want to do about it?" Hamilton didn't hesitate. "We speak up. Not just me. All of us. The veterans. The legends. The ones who still believe in the purity of this sport. We start pushing for clearer definitions, better communication protocols, real-time alerts that actually work. We push the FIA to rethink, not to loosen the rules, but to align them with racing logic. This isn't about breaking limits, it's about knowing where they are." The silence that followed was not empty, it was heavy with agreement, with intent. Two men, no longer bound by team contracts, but still bound by a shared history, understood each other perfectly in that moment. Hamilton wasn't asking for favoritism. He was asking for transparency, fairness, clarity, and above all, respect for the racer's craft. As the call ended and Hamilton returned to the motorhome, the fire in him hadn't dimmed. If anything, it had crystallized into resolve. He wasn't done talking. He wasn't done fighting. This wasn't the end of a phone call, it was the beginning of a new message. One he would deliver in press conferences, in debriefs, in closed FIA meetings. Because for Lewis Hamilton, racing had never been about obeying silence. It had always been about driving change. He eventually turned his attention inward, bringing the conversation back to Ferrari and the issues that had been quietly festering behind the scenes all season. His tone wasn't one of fury or dramatics, it was far more cutting than that. It came from a place of disbelief, of mounting exasperation layered over months of compromises, missed calls, and strategic hesitations that continued to cripple their efforts on Sundays. Lewis Hamilton didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. When he spoke in low, measured tones like he did that evening, every word carried weight. He wasn't just frustrated with rivals or officials, he was deeply unsettled by what he saw as an absence of clarity in high-pressure moments from the people who were supposed to be in sync with him. "How many times do I have to raise this before it actually sinks in?" he said, standing just inside the edge of the team's temporary operations center. "We've talked about this. We've run simulations. We've reviewed incidents. But when it really counts, when we're neck-deep in a live scenario and everything is moving fast, we're not delivering the information in real time. We're not being direct. There's no margin for interpretation when you're traveling over 300 kilometers an hour. There has to be certainty, precision, no room for doubt." The engineers around him didn't argue. They knew. They had seen the data, heard the radio chatter, watched the replays, and most of all, felt the sting of knowing that if they'd reacted moments earlier or more forcefully, the outcome could have shifted dramatically. In motorsport, timing isn't just important, it's everything. A half-second delay in communication can be the difference between defending a position and losing 2 places in one corner. And in a championship fight, those losses accumulate like slow poison. Hamilton wasn't accusing individuals. He was diagnosing a systemic fragility that had become too visible to ignore. He wasn't just battling Red Bull, Mercedes, and McLaren on track, he was also wrestling with an internal disjointedness that undermined the potential of the car and the people behind it. For a driver who had built his career on razor-sharp instincts and unmatched adaptability, the lack of synchronization between his cockpit awareness and the pit wall's execution was infuriating. As the tension lingered, it was Mercedes team boss Toto Wolff, of all people, who unexpectedly crossed paths with Hamilton in a quiet corridor behind the media compound. The two exchanged a brief, familiar glance, a moment filled with more history than words could express. Wolff didn't offer sympathy. He never did. Instead, he issued a quiet challenge, a call to arms dressed as advice. "You've got Silverstone coming," Wolff said, almost in a whisper. "You know what that race means for you. You've turned frustration into brilliance more times than anyone else I've seen. Don't let this weigh you down. Convert it. Make it yours." Hamilton nodded, slowly, but his response was guarded, more calculated than grateful. "I'll turn it into something useful," he replied. "But I need to feel protected out there. I need to know when I take a risk, or when something happens, the team isn't sitting back waiting for the perfect moment. I didn't feel that today. I felt exposed." And in Formula One, feeling exposed is lethal. It sows hesitation where there should be instinct. It turns certainty into guesswork. And it forces even the most elite drivers to operate with a mental handbrake. Hamilton's body language the rest of the day spoke volumes. He kept his circle small, spoke to no journalists, and didn't fulfill any post-race promotional obligations. Instead, he disappeared into the debrief room, alongside his performance engineer and lead strategist, watching the onboard footage in near silence. Every frame was analyzed. Every input compared. He paused the playback repeatedly at the same sequence, the now infamous moment where Norris lunged late on the brakes and forced the contact. Hamilton kept replaying the milliseconds leading up to it, studying not just the positioning but also the radio communication. What was said? What wasn't? What could have been said sooner? At no point did Hamilton raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence in the room was suffocating, heavier than any outburst. His focus was absolute, and everyone there knew what that meant. He wasn't sulking, he was loading ammunition for the next battle. He was processing the chaos and converting it into purpose. Outside the engineering suite, the usually lively Ferrari garage had fallen into an eerie calm. Tools were being packed away in total silence. Conversations were hushed, minimal. Even the PR team had paused all uploads and updates, waiting for some direction. The penalty itself, a 10-second addition, was minor in numerical terms. But emotionally, it was catastrophic. It marked yet another instance where Hamilton had to claw his way through a situation that should have been handled proactively, not reactively. It was another reminder that the real battle wasn't just happening on the track. A veteran mechanic, speaking quietly to a colleague as they loaded tires into the team truck, summarized the mood perfectly. "We're not just losing to the others. We're losing to ourselves." That was the most damning realization of all. The car had potential. The drivers were capable. But there was no cohesion, no sense of urgency when things began unraveling. The opposition didn't need to outdevelop Ferrari. They just needed to capitalize on the moments when Ferrari failed to execute. And in this sport, those moments were everything. As the paddock began to shut down for the night, and the floodlights buzzed faintly overhead, Hamilton finally stood from his seat. His expression was unreadable, but his posture was unmistakable, straight, shoulders back, jaw set. He unplugged his headset, gathered his notes, and without saying a word, nodded once to his engineer before stepping out into the darkness outside. The silence that followed him wasn't just physical. It was symbolic. It carried a message to the entire team, that next weekend, the stage would be his, and no one, absolutely no one, could afford to get it wrong. Not this time. Not at Silverstone. Not on the weekend where every eye would be on him, every corner would echo with his legacy, and every second would demand not only speed, but unity. Because if Ferrari wanted to stand with him on the podium again, they'd need to stop waiting for the right moment, and start creating it. Inside the clinical, overly sanitized confines of the FIA's Media Operations Center, where everything feels too still, too perfect, too devoid of the chaos that defines a race weekend, the statement came without drama. It was cold. Predictable. A press release in its most bureaucratic form. Car 44 was observed violating track boundaries on several laps at turns 9 and 10. Despite multiple warnings relayed through formal communications, the competitor failed to consistently remain inside the designated white lines demarcating the edge of the circuit. A time adjustment of 10 seconds has been imposed following the conclusion of the race. It read like a routine footnote in a long race summary, but its impact would be anything but. There was no emotion in the document. Just facts, lines, time codes. A regulatory summary meant to be filed away like a footnote in a rulebook. But outside that sterile press room, back in the paddock, where rubber still clung to every surface and adrenaline had yet to settle, those 10 seconds hit like a slap across the face of a legacy. Lewis Hamilton didn't comment. No media address. No post on his usually vibrant Instagram feed. No brief nod to the situation in front of the press pens. Instead, his silence said everything. It wasn't the silence of indifference. It was the kind of calculated, boiling quiet that signaled something deeper than frustration. Something systemic. Something personal. Those closest to him recognized the shift in his posture, the almost robotic movements as he exited the Ferrari garage. This wasn't disappointment over a single result. It was disappointment with the structure around him, a system meant to be flawless but now cracking under the weight of expectations. In private, his anger wasn't theatrical. It didn't erupt. It simmered, tight and precise, like pressure building behind a dam. Inside the Ferrari operations room, he dissected the incident not as a mistake, but as a symptom. The real frustration wasn't with the stewards, it was with the absence of foresight from his own pit wall. In a race where millimeters defined positions and tenths of a second decided fates, how had warnings gone unnoticed? Why hadn't anyone been proactive? He had seen the red and white signs, felt the vibrating curves, heard the alerts in his earpiece, but none of it had been translated into clear, urgent team orders. His engineer had relayed warnings, yes, but without clarity, without the gravitas that demanded immediate response. It was another example, in a growing list, of misaligned priorities. Hamilton, a driver whose greatness had been forged through obsessive precision and team cohesion, was now caught in a structure that wasn't yet operating at the level he needed. And every tiny crack in Ferrari's foundation was being exposed under the relentless heat of his standards. His debrief was short but surgical. He demanded clarity, asked for time-stamped data, requested audio logs from the race radio team. He wasn't emotional, he was analytical, but that coldness masked a deeper fury. One staffer later described the atmosphere as paralytic, where no one knew whether to speak or just wait for him to leave. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The gravity of his disappointment did all the talking. Meanwhile, the rest of the grid began digesting the development in real time. In the McLaren garage, a group of engineers chuckled over the absurdity of it all, Hamilton, of all people, getting a basic track limits penalty. At Red Bull, it was taken more seriously. One of their senior data analysts quietly noted that Ferrari had failed to give Hamilton a sector-by-sector response within 30 seconds of the first warning, a basic principle in today's data-driven racing landscape. Mercedes team members watched replays on tablets, whispering amongst themselves. They knew what this kind of thing did to Hamilton. Not the penalty, but the incompetence. As he walked out of the garage, he barely acknowledged the camera crews waiting just outside the roped-off media zone. His helmet still in hand, racing boots clicking against the polished floor, Hamilton moved like someone deep in calculation. A machine behind a man. Those who recognized that walk remembered it. It was the same stride he had after the blown engine in Malaysia, the same path he took after Silverstone 2021, the same unreadable expression he wore leaving Abu Dhabi after the final lap debacle. Back in the hospitality unit, Charles Leclerc sat with his trainer, eating quietly, eyes locked on the TV showing highlights of the race on loop. He didn't say anything about the penalty, but his look betrayed a mix of relief and unease. Relief that he hadn't been the one penalized, but discomfort at knowing the storm now brewing within their shared garage would eventually pull him into its vortex. The two had barely spoken all weekend, exchanging only functional dialogue during meetings and brief nods before qualifying. Whatever trust had once begun to form was now teetering, unsteady, weakened by missed opportunities and conflicting styles of leadership. The Ferrari team principal had already received 3 calls from Italy within the hour. Sponsors were worried. Corporate HQ wanted to know if damage control would be necessary. The PR department scrambled to issue a generic response that avoided naming Hamilton directly but subtly acknowledged the incident. Behind the scenes, internal communications buzzed with tension. A scheduled team-building event ahead of Spa was abruptly postponed, officially due to logistical conflicts, unofficially because no one could imagine Hamilton and Leclerc sharing a campfire dinner anytime soon. Everywhere in the paddock, there was a shift in tone. Conversations changed. Team principals eyed Ferrari with growing curiosity. Journalists began crafting questions that were less about lap times and more about leadership. And among rival drivers, there was a quiet recognition. Hamilton, the lion, was caged. And caged lions don't stay calm forever. In the simulator suite the following morning, Hamilton requested an extra session, not to prepare for Spa, but to analyze his line through turns 9 and 10 in forensic detail. He didn't trust the telemetry summary. He needed to feel the mistakes in real time. To understand how it happened. Or more precisely, how it was allowed to happen. The simulator engineers said little. They just made the adjustments, loaded the model, and stepped back. Watching him drive in silence, lap after lap after lap, was like witnessing a storm collect moisture over open water. You didn't know when it would strike, but you knew it would. And in Maranello, the tension was already percolating into strategy meetings. Technical departments quietly began drawing contingency frameworks. HR reps discussed morale issues. The leadership circle knew that the situation wasn't just unstable, it was radioactive. Because Hamilton didn't get this angry for nothing. He wasn't here to participate. He was here to rewrite history. And history doesn't tolerate incompetence. Everyone knew what was coming. The question now wasn't whether Hamilton would snap. It was whether Ferrari could evolve fast enough to match the standard of the man they had recruited to lead them back to glory. Because if they couldn't, the 10-second penalty would be remembered not as a minor footnote, but as the first crack in a project that promised greatness, but may have been doomed by its inability to rise to the level of the legend behind the wheel.